Welcome to AP U.S. History. We'll be looking at the colonial life in the 18th century. Um, in the 18th century, we saw enormous population growth in the 13 colonies from 1700 to the Revolutionary War. We go from 300,000 to 2.5, which is pretty significant. The largest colonies were Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Maryland. Uh, Primarily, people lived in rural settings. They were farms. They weren't too many cities, but the majority of the people lived in the rural areas, the farming areas, prior to the Revolutionary War. America seemed to be a melting pot, but the primary language spoken in the colonies was English. South held over 90% of the slaves. New England was the least ethnically mixed. Predominantly, it was Puritans. Middle colonies, probably more of a melting pot than any place else in the colonies, the 13 colonies. Outside of New England, about one half of the population were non English in 1775, but they will adopt the English language. African Americans account for about 20% of the population up to 1775. This shows the 13 colonies. Um, and again, we'll keep looking at what's going on there. Um, in terms of class structure, there was a small upper class. In the South, it was the aristocrats who owned the large plantations. In the middle colonies, it were more the merchants, lawyers, and government officials and clergymen. In the farmers of the middle colonies, Pennsylvania and the like, yeoman farmers were. It was more an equitable kind of society in the more of an equal footing for the people living in the middle colonies. Uh, then you had the lesser tradesmen and the manual laborers and hired hands who did not own land. And of course, at the bottom of the heap would have been slaves and Native Americans. This shows a picture of a plantation hacked out of the wilderness, out of the pine trees, and uh, they grew rice and indigo, primarily in the southern colonies, where tobacco and um, whatnot are grown in the Chesapeake area. Indentured servants, again, they would have been down on the scale, but a step up from slaves. In terms of trade and commerce, the triangular trade, again, an illegal trade that circumnavigated or got around the navigation laws that were passed by England to prevent people from trading with other countries. New Englanders used the molasses from the Caribbean to make rum. And then that rum is sold back to the West Africa for slaves, and then the slaves are sold for rum and or it's molasses, and then molasses is transported back to the New England colonies and other, lower colonies and sold, and also sent back to England to make rum. So the sugar trade was quite valuable, and as well as the slaves. This shows the triangular trade. Land speculation investors became wealthy because people bought and sold land in the colonies. Manufacturing was pretty limited until after the Revolutionary War. Primarily, the colonies existed to send raw materials back to England and buy finished goods. There was also a shortage of money, so it made it difficult sometimes to exchange or buy things. Typically, it was a barter system. Uh, Lumbering and shipbuilding, you see this in the New England colonies. Um, Limited amount of weaving. Uh, Furs are still valuable and traded for uh, from the Native Americans and sent back to Europe. Of course, shipbuilding primarily in New England, and also fishing. The characteristics again. Uh, People, very few people living in cities. This diagram show or this picture shows taverns. They became meeting places. News was exchanged. You have to understand there was no radio, television. The only news primarily came from newspapers, word of mouth, those kinds of things. Religion was very important, at least in the New England and the Middle colonies, not to the same degree in the Southern colonies. But in the 18th century, uh, you have about 1 in 7 attending church. Quakers in Rhode Island are going to be kind of an exception to this rule. Um, but they also guaranteed religious freedom, and you didn't have to pay a tax, and you didn't have to go to church. Eventually, uh, religious rights will be there will be the separation of church and state after the Revolutionary War. So this is something that's going to come after the Revolution, not before. Puritans were very strict in their location. The Quakers, the Baptists, certainly more lenient, and in the South, the Anglican Church. Uh, not many folks were going to church there, basically because they were so the plantations were so far apart from one another. There were churches in some of the towns like Jamestown and Charlestown and some of those areas, but you have to understand that there weren't too many cities in the South. It was primarily rural plantations. The Anglican Church, you had to pay a tax, as did you have to pay in the Puritan location. Um, the Anglican Church was viewed as a branch of the royal government, and they were supported by the government, and they forced people to pay tax. The Congregational Church grew out of the Puritan Church. At one time was part of the Anglican Church. The Congregational Church was primarily concerned with selecting their own pastors, where the Anglican Church, they were appointed to the different churches. Um, at least in the New England area, Calvinist, that is predestination, was taught that you were the elect, chosen by God before the foundations of the world. And the communities developed around the church. Um, Very devout, zealot, spiritual in the beginning. As time wore on, less so. The Presbyterian Church and the Congregational Church are closely associated. Um, Basically, it has to do with the governing of the church. Um, there was no official church in any colony, although some were favored over others. The Baptists are primarily going to be found in Rhode Island, and they are an offshoot of the Puritan Church. They reject infant baptism. They believe that an individual must be of an age of accountability to understand the accepting Jesus Christ as their Savior. Quakers, primarily in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Rhode Island, looked down upon by the Puritans and also the Anglican Church, were against slavery, and led many of the reforms in the colonies and later in the United States. they were very tolerant of other religions. This shows a picture of the first Baptist church in Rhode Island. Jewish population, very few came to the New World. Mostly found in Rhode Island and New York and Pennsylvania. Were not treated well by the colonists, were considered heretics, and thus pretty inhospitable. The Great Awakening is going to take place in the 1730s and 1740s. This was a first mass social movement in American history, and it spread throughout the middle and southern colonies. Interesting to note that it may have gotten a start in the New England colonies, but it has the greatest effect on the southern colonies and the middle colonies. They were more interested in the Great Awakening with an experience rather than church practice, some personal faith. You actually felt and you experienced something by becoming a believer. The movement was against just dogma and rituals, but you were supposed to have a personal relationship with God. There was an experience that you felt it. You felt something in your soul when you embraced Jesus Christ. And it was to lead you to a holy life. Of course, they stood against liberal doctrines. The Arminianism, which says that you controlled your own destination, they would have rejected that. They did believe that you could receive a direct inspiration of God, and they believed in total corruption of man. Jonathan Edwards is someone to know. He's credited with starting the Great Awakening, died at a young age, and preached hellfire and brimstone, that people were damned to hell if they did not change their ways and accept Christ. His style was reasoned and deliberate, not considered a new light in some respects. Jonathan Edwards is revered as one of those theologians that had a tremendous effect on American society. Didn't live very long. George Whitefield is probably the one that had the greatest impact during the Great Awakening, and he traveled up and down the colonists, preached to literally thousands of people. Probably it's credit to 100,000 people coming to the Christ because of his preaching. He and John Wesley were friends. They delivered their message. They're considered new lights. And they are rejected by the old lights. They think that they're a little overboard. As far as the impact of the Great Awakening, it pretty much gives the colonists a feeling that they are one people. And this is going to be important in terms of later banding together against England. They encouraged evangelism, laid a foundation of anti-intellectualism as part of their character. And we'll stop right there. We'll pick this up next time in part 2.